Well, the other place that things were happening really for the first time that we've seen is, of course, online. This is probably where I was getting most of my information, and lots of well, I'm a time waster. Anybody watching us talking now is clearly wasting their time. Having, but I'm not thinking so much of the direct coverage itself, but the way a whole new arena opened up for humour, to become part of the campaign, for the most sort of scurrilous slanders to be disseminated very
that was
easily.
Excellent, and that was in some ways balanced the mundanity of the reporting in the standard media. But I think in a sense that was a spin-off. I mean, one of the things that happened early in the campaign was Rudd decided to pull the switch to vaudeville, as Paul Keating once put it, and he went on all those daytime television shows and FM radio, and was interviewed by people with names like Daffy and Muffy and Clark. And they were all there saying, "And what colour are your underpants, Mr. Rudd?" And then
he went dancing with the stars.
Yes, and that sort of developed into the internet campaign and all the Kevin 07 nonsense. And I don't think if you looked at it, not many people actually took notice of that internet campaign. I mean, if you looked at the number of hits, as we say, on the various political contributions and blogs, there weren't many. I mean, there may have been a couple of thousand at most on the popular ones, but it's hardly the stuff that determines the course of elections. It was more a way of letting off steam than anything else.
I suppose to some extent, although I think it's very hard to calculate some of those things, particularly, say, with younger voters who were, maybe even coming in for the first time. And as you say, there's sort of combination of being, really fed up with, this old codger who'd been there since they were 8.
And before, since their parents were.
It only felt like that, surely. As you mentioned in the book, those campaigns to get early enrolment happening and so on, they were pretty successful.
They were very important, and I think that was one of the areas in which the net really did help, that it got people off their bums and into the voting booths who otherwise mightn't have done so. I don't know whether it had much to do with the way they voted when they got there, but at least it got them into the booths. And I think, equally to be fair, I mean, things like Get Up, I think were reasonably influential in the campaign because they drew people's attention to issues which they might have preferred to ignore. And so we had a lot of stuff about David Hicks in the early days, and we had a lot of stuff about climate change and so on. And that I think did have an effect on the campaign generally. It changed the emphasis of the way politicians were looking at various issues. But whether it actually changed a lot of votes is another question.
On to Rudd for a moment.
A moment will be enough.
Well, you talk in the book about, in a sense, warming to him.
Yes.
And I think that was a widespread reaction, that there'd be a combination of a sort of natural scepticism about any politician. His conspicuous lack of charisma, and so on, all seem to be, in a sense, negatives for him. And then really over the course of the campaign, and particularly as it neared the end, where he was beginning to loosen up and there was a bit of lightness to his step, he became easier to like, I think.
Yes, I think there were two things going on here. One was that he did loosen up a bit over the campaign, but the other was that as Howard became less and less attractive, Rudd by definition became more so, and that people then did start to look for the good bits of Rudd so they could justify voting for him. And I found my meetings with Rudd, I've always found him a reasonably personable sort of guy, not easy to talk to, but friendly and with a sense of humour and with a certain amount of passion and so on. I spent Melbourne Cup Day with him in Ballina at the RSL, of all places, and Rudd, more or less by accident, had backed efficient. And there we were watching the thing on television, and Rudd was getting quite excited because obviously he doesn't go to the races an awful lot. And he sort of started saying, "Oh, look at this grey coming down the outside. Look at it go, isn't it a wonderful run?"
Yeah.
And he didn't even realise it was his horse. He was just getting excited about it.
Yeah,
and when
colourful racing identity he ate.
Yes. And when he did realise it was his horse, there was an absolute childlike glee. You know?
Yeah. And the name of the horse couldn't have been better for him.
So I found that a little touching, you know, that he was this quite human side to the man. And he has got fire in the belly. I mean, there's no doubt about that. He can get quite angry and passionate. And I found after the election, which we only found out about after the election, that even during the last 2 weeks he'd spent his weekend evenings going to visit homeless shelters and not telling anybody about it without any media or any publicity whatsoever. I thought, you know, there's something to this guy. It's not all, you know, facade and efficiency and, you know, just being terribly well self-disciplined. There's more to it, more to him than that.
Yeah, he reminds me a bit of that sort of type that, you know, that we've all worked with, you know, somewhere in those of us who've ever been in a sort of larger organisation. He's the sort of the bloke in charge of, you know, the personnel department or something like that.
Yes,
you know.
there's an element about him.
And you know, he's a bit
calls him the dentist.
yeah. It's something a bit sort of stitched up, and he's at work too early, and he's just finishing something off, so he can't come and have a drink with you afterwards, and you're probably a bit relieved because, you know,
yes, something wouldn't have been much fun.
Wouldn't have been much fun, but you don't doubt, you know, his sort of fundamental honesty, and you don't expect him to. You'd be very surprised if he perpetrated some act of bastardry on you.
I think so. Yes, I think he's fundamentally a decent sort of bloke. And I've actually found myself having a couple of quite interesting conversations with him over the time of the election campaign, not about politics, but about books and stuff, you know, so, which I can't imagine for a second ever doing with John Howard.
Oh, well, no. I mean, a biography of Churchill, perhaps, or something.
Cricket.
Cricket, yeah.
But that's about it. But I mean, there is more to Rudd than that, and I think he could be a very interesting Prime Minister. He's going to have a hell of a time keeping that party in control. But again, that was one of the surprises of the campaign, that it wasn't just him who was well disciplined, it was the whole mob. And with Julia Gillard in particular, I mean, he had to have Julia Gillard's support to become leader in the beginning. That was part of the deal. He couldn't have made it without. But given that he and Julia Gillard couldn't bear to be in the same suburb a year before that, let alone the same room, it was a marriage that was always going to be dicky. And I think a lot of us, I certainly, expected there to be blow-ups during the campaign where the two of them did part company, but they didn't. They stuck to the script extraordinarily well.
Well, she was treated, in a sense, almost as a kind of liability for him. She was judged to be that by the press early in the piece.
Yes, at the direction of Howard and the Liberal Party, who told the press to judge her as a liability. And I think there was a feeling that it was a weak point, that she could fly off the handle, that she might end up being a loose cannon. But in the event she didn't. She was the loyal little helpmeet from beginning to end. As such, I think, has now put herself seriously in the running to become a successor to Rudd as Prime Minister. Something I would never have said of a left-wing woman 2 years ago.
No, that's. I agree with you about that. She's, if not quite blossomed, I'm not sure if she would ever fully blossom.
I think she's more retreated.
Yes, she's certainly begun to make herself certainly much more, or she's become much more, in a sense, sort of approachable in a personal sense.
And I think she's become more mainstream, as we say in political terms. You know, she's no longer a sort of maverick red-headed lefty. She's somebody who is acceptable as a Deputy Prime Minister and could even be acceptable in the top job. I mean, let's face it, Anna Bligh in Queensland's a lefty woman who's made it to Premier. It's no longer totally unfeasible.
No, well, we had our own, one here in Victoria as well, of course.
Oh, yeah, but only having been sold the hospital pass.
Yeah.
Having it dumped on her, same with Carmen Lawrence in the West.
Yeah. So, you're sounding pretty optimistic then. Is this just the euphoria of being told that the tests have come back and you no longer have terminal cancer, or is this?
Well, there's an element of this about it. I mean, the great relief of finally getting out of the shadow of Howard. But also, I do think that there's a promise to Rudd. I mean, even if he only does half of what he says he's going to do in terms of reforming the political system and bringing some sort of ethics back to it, that'll be worth doing. That we can be grateful to him for that. And even if we don't actually realise Rudd's grand vision of us becoming a real intermediary between the United States and China and the people who sort out climate change and bring the sides together and blah, blah, blah. At least we can regain a bit of respect on the international circuit, which I'm sure we lost under Howard. And all this crap about, Alexander Downer used to go on with about, we punch above our weight in international circles. What that meant was that they were nice to him when he went to Washington. It didn't mean anything else at all. But now, with a smidgen of independence back, I think we can become a good international citizen again. And I won't have to keep apologising for the government whenever I go overseas. I mean, that'd be nice too.
Yes, that got quite to be a standard feature of being a travelling Australian.
Didn't it? Yeah.
About this time last year, I was in Mexico, in the deepest jungles of Yucatan, where I had travelled by rickety bus in order to climb an ancient Mayan pyramid.
As one does.
And so there I am sitting at the top of the Temple of the Jaguar amid these sort of strange hieroglyphic depictions of a long dead civilization, when behind me I heard an Australian voice and looked around, and there was a man complaining to an American about John Howard.
Yes, I can do better than that. A few years ago I was halfway up a mountain in Nepal by myself with nobody there but a guide and a porter, as I thought. And as we were getting over yet another pass, gasping for breath, the porter looked at me and said, "Why do you have Pauline Hanson in your country?"
Word gets around, doesn't it? So we're talking about, you're talking, I suppose, about what Keating called the moral basis of
yes, I am, and I think that's important. I mean, I think that cynical as we are about politicians, we should remember that it's not a dishonourable calling, and it's a necessary calling. I mean, politics remains the only way to solve disputes without killing people when you get down to it. And we do deserve to have good politicians, although perhaps we have to earn them more than we have in the past. But it's a calling which is worthy of respect, and I want to be able to respect my politicians. I want to be able to feel that the Prime Minister is somebody worthy of leading the country, when I never felt that with Howard, not for 1 minute.
Well, we're of an accord in that matter, but I just wonder, why should we assume that is not also important for possibly a majority of our countrymen?
Perhaps because they don't themselves regard it as being terribly important. They think that life goes on. Whoever you vote for, a politician always gets in. Life will go on. We'll muddle through. It's not all that important. I mean, we don't have a history of needing heroic politicians much. I mean, people think of John Curtin, perhaps in the war years, as a heroic Australian leader. But outside him, there aren't too many. And we don't, and as I say, we've never needed them. We have been the lucky country. We haven't had huge external threats or huge internal disruption and chaos of one kind and another. The economy's by and large been kind to us. I mean, so we regard politicians as sort of parasites on the system rather than people who are meant to be helping to manage it. I think that's one reason. I mean, every so often we have this outbreak of idealism, and good leaders can bring it out in us. And I think that's again where I have hopes for Rudd, that he will be able to bring out the best parts of Australia rather than the worst parts, which were the ones that Howard constantly appealed to.
So you think he might successfully harness the better angels of our nature in this
I do.
instance?
I'm optimistic, but I'm always optimistic. That's a foolish thing to be. I'm always optimistic, except at election times.
Well, you're also guarded in your optimism to some extent because you have mentioned the difficulty that he's going to face in holding the party, together in government, the various forces.
And as always happens with a Labor government, he's inherited an economy at the wrong stage of the cycle, so that's going to be a big problem, and he won't be able to keep all his promises. He's still heroically saying he will, but he won't. And that's going to be a political problem as well as every other kind of problem. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I'm just saying it's going to be better.
Where do you think his problems from his own team are going to come
from? From those who believe that they're only in for a good time and a short time rather than a long time, and who want to get things done in a rush, and are going to try and push for quick and popular moves right from the beginning instead of being in it for the long haul. I mean, Rudd is quite clearly looking at 3 terms, the way his election manifesto came out. There are a lot of them who aren't. There are a lot of them who know that this is probably going to be their last go-round, and they want to sort of build their own monument in the brief time they'll have as ministers. And that, I think, is going to be one of the big problems. I don't think the unions are going to be too difficult at all, although some of the commentators are saying that the unions will start being disruptive early in the piece. I don't think they will. I think the unions realise that whatever's wrong with Rudd, there was a great deal more wrong with the other side, and they don't want to go back to it. And I think that, the other problem may be with the media, that he's raised expectations a bit too high, particularly this stuff about being a serious player on the international stage and being able to, influence events in a way that Australia hasn't for a long time. We are a small power and we should remember it.
You think the traditional structures of the party still residually represent any sort of danger or
I don't think
grounds for caution?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the residual structures
well,
of the party
I'm thinking here of, for example, the selection of his own cabinet. Now, really he was going to do that anyway. It's the factions propose and the Prime Minister disposes. But
it's often the other way around. Of course, the Prime Minister proposes and the factions said, you can have X, Y, and Z, but you can't have A, B, and C. This time he got the lot.
Well, so at least to some extent, there's one of the traditional structural elements of the party.
Yeah, but I think the factions breaking down and are breaking down quickly after a long period of being on top and then going over the top. I think that one of the good influences of the last few years, first under Crean and then under Beazley again and then under Rudd, is that the factions are no longer anything like the force they used to be. And that's one of the reasons, incidentally. I think it's possible Julia Gillard could become Prime Minister. She never could when the factional system was rigid. So I think that we can possibly get rid of the factions to a large extent and have, if not a real meritocracy, because you never can have that in any political structure, but you can get something where you don't get all the bloody logs on the front bench that we've had in the past.
So you get rid of the factions. What you've got is
not altogether, but you break them down into something close to being, clubs rather than, militias, if you like.
Their power's no longer there. The whole leadership style is a presidential one. You've got a diminishing and effectively disenfranchised branch membership. Is this the end?
I think you're going to see...
think they'll be flocking to the standards now?
Well, not necessarily flocking, but I think you'll see a bit of a revival. And I think you'll see one of the things that Rudd insists on is that branches be treated rather more seriously than they have in the past. I mean, that doesn't mean that they're going to have sole say over pre-selections or whatever, but it does mean that they'll have more say and the factions will have less and the unions will have less. I think that's a fairly safe bet. The factions were code for the unions, let's face it.
But he's calling the shots on that. He's saying, well, we want to see a bit more activity going on in the branches. Yeah. That'd be nice. And so, every 24-year-old with a politics degree thinks I'm in with a shot here. I better rush down and join a local Labor Party branch if I'm ever going to go anywhere.
I think quite a few will.
Well, certainly because there's a chance that they'll make their way upwards into one of the corps of Praetorian Guards that now surround the ministers.
They're mad, of course. I mean, if I were a 24-year-old with a politics degree now and simply a desire to succeed in politics, I'd join the Liberal Party. There's plenty of room at the top there.
A land of opportunity.
Plenty of room at the top.
The style of Rudd, his background as a bureaucrat, the steady as she goes kind of approach to things, the absence of any.
Steady as she goes, but I mean, when you look at that election platform, it's not unambitious. I mean, the broadband policy, the education policy, the idea of taking the hospital reform, the climate change policy. I mean, there's a lot there. There's a lot of really solid stuff there, and that's not steady as she goes. That is changing the country.
Well, to some extent, but as we saw in his acceptance speech, if that was indeed an acceptance speech, that the high guys settle down, rabbit on kind of thing. We weren't seeing any kind of grand vision. There wasn't even the sort of puff of uplifting rhetoric down wings at that point.
But that's his fault for not having a decent speechwriter, I suppose. I mean, you couldn't. The material's there,
or fear of in fact wanting to sort of unleash some sort of sense of expectation. What I'm suggesting, I suppose, is that maybe what we're seeing is the end of ideologically driven politics.
I think we saw that a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think there's been any serious ideological politics in Australia since about 1960.
Howard versus Keating did take on an ideological demeanour about it,
Well, not really. I mean, it was much more. It was more about style than it was about substance. Howard versus Keating. I mean, it was Keating, the great visionary, the man with the big picture, blah blah blah. Howard, the one with the white picket fence, making everybody relaxed and comfortable. I mean, that's not ideology, that style. I mean, both of them they all believe in economic reform, quote. These days, they all believe in a certain amount of government intervention in affairs, but not too much. They all believe, or they say they do, in small government and low taxation. I mean, there's really not a huge amount of ideology left in Australian politics, but there is. There are priorities. I mean, where do you put something like Aboriginal affairs on your scale of things to do? With Howard, was you forget about it until the very last moment. With Rudd, that's not going to be the case. It is going to be a priority because social justice in that sense is higher up the scale for Labor than it is for the Libs. we are going to have more respect for the United Nations than the Libs do. I mean, that is, I suppose, a point of genuine difference. But there aren't too many of them. I mean, we are, as I say, talking more about priorities and style than we are about substantial ideological differences. Nobody wants to nationalise the banks anymore.
Triumph of managerialism?
Up to a point, but when you're living in a country like Australia, that's really what it's about. You can't determine the way the economy runs in a global economy of these days. I mean, the governments really have very, very little control over the basics of what happens to the Australian economy, but they have a great deal of ability to manage it, to try and make it more comfortable, to try and smooth the edges off and cushion the worst effects. I mean, that is, in a sense, the role of governments these days.
Well, it's been great talking with you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Shane.